Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, and we're about to start this session. Good afternoon and welcome to this session on Africa's climate change challenge. Now, sub-Saharan Africa is widely considered the most vulnerable area of the world to the effects of climate change. Many African countries are already suffering from various forms of climate-related stress, such as droughts and floods and rainfall variability. Now, this year, for example, Mozambique was devastated by Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth, one of the worst natural disasters ever seen in the Southern Hemisphere, and whose damage will cost the Southern African region more than $2 billion in repair. So today we're going to be asking, what measures should African leaders take to prepare for the increasing severity of weather-related disasters? This afternoon, my panel will also look at the question of resilience and vulnerability and explore solutions in the context of Africa's changing climate reality. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now welcome my distinguished panel, His Excellency Danny Faure, the President of the Seychelles, Director Andiswa Mlisa. She's the Managing Director, Earth Observation, South African National Space Agency, SANSA, in South Africa. Dr. Helmut Fluhrer, he's the founder and chief executive officer of WeatherTec in Switzerland, and we are very interested to hear about your rainmaking initiative. And Strebel, the managing director and head of the Middle East and Africa Swiss Re in Switzerland. We'll be talking about insurance with you. President Faure, I'm going to start off with you and jump right into it, because climate change does present quite unique challenges for the small island developing states. And if the world fails to halt global warming, they may disappear altogether. So what is the one step that your government is taking that has had the greatest impact in combating climatic risks, reducing vulnerability, and building resilience?
I think the number one thing that we have done as Seychelles and also as a member of the community is to say that it is our human right to survive. So it is a question of our own survival as members of one humanity. So climate change is the number one threat to humanity. Not the number one threat to our continent, but it's the number one threat to humanity. So we take it very seriously. So as a small island country with other small island nations within the African continent, we have been able to mobilize the continent, and I'm happy to say today that within the African continent, we have one common position in terms of climate change. Of course, Africa as one continent is also vulnerable. Not only vulnerable, but we have the least in terms of capacity to adapt. So as a country, we have put in place mechanism. In Seychelles, we have the right national policies in place. And over the last 30 years, my government, we have done a lot in terms of creating the necessary mechanisms to put in place the right mitigation strategies in terms of how do we create the necessary resilience against this number one threat to humanity.
So when you talk about Africa has a common climate change policy, though, do you think Africa's concerns are receiving enough international attention?
So basically, as a continent, we continue to advocate, but it all depends on other nations around the world. And in December, we will be going to the COP25 as one united Africa to continue to press for the necessary financing in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
So, Andiswa, from rising, waters to flooding to droughts across the continent, we've seen it all, and your technology, I'm sure, has been monitoring this across the continent. So let's look at a real-life example here and look at the situation of Mozambique and Cyclone Idai and Kenneth that caused massive devastation there. In terms of early preparedness, early warning systems, did we see that coming?
Unfortunately not. And this is one of the things that makes climate change so devastating for countries like continents like Africa, where we've got the least vulnerable people. And our technologies are meant to enable this. From a National Space Agency perspective, data is the order of the day. We're talking about democratizing data, building platforms and systems that will enable our government to build early warning systems is one of the critical issues. So one of the major things that we're needing to be looking at is that science and data is an enabler into this environment. So how do we build early warning systems that are informed by data, reliable data, timely data, accurate data? And in this instance, we're looking at platforms like Digital Earth Africa, where we're taking satellite data, 40 to 50 years of data. You know, we've been in space. Most people might remember the moon landing. We're celebrating 50 years of being in the moon. That's how long we've been collecting data over the continent and globally, environmental monitoring it, that we can actually ask questions to it. But we're scientists, so for decades, we've been playing around with this data and saying, yeah, you can monitor floods, you can actually monitor drought, you can be resilient to it if you use it this way, but we haven't managed to operationalize it. Digital Earth Africa is one of the key flagship programs that we have now in the continent to say to our governments, here is a platform where satellite data, over 50 years of monitoring, we've managed to put it in a platform where it's easily accessible, and where products are easily accessible to anyone and any man on the street. It's a game changer if you're thinking about it. Now, for Cyclone Idai, if we actually had a platform like that before, it's a question of people are what governments care about the most. It's all about people, it's their livelihoods. And with data, satellite data specifically, we're talking about the power of where. Where are the likely places where the flooding will occur, and who will be impacted when that occurs? How do you do your evacuation plans? If your roads get clogged up because you've got so many people that you're needing to be transporting through a particular road, how do you prepare to make sure you've got exit routes? And all of this, spatially, and with your spatial data, you can actually manage. Now, if we had these early warning systems and preparedness up front, what we get to call a disaster, because the geohazards are gonna happen, the rainfalls are gonna come. This we cannot change. It's going to happen, but it's how it impacts us as people that it matters the most. And for that, we need to make sure that we've got strong enough early warning systems, but we need to make sure that data plays a good part in preparing our early warning systems.
So, Dr. Fluhrer, your company invented, a technology, a system that creates rain and rainfall. And I do want to draw on your example from Jordan, where that technology boosted an increase of about 27% of rainfall over 5,000 kilometers. This can be an answer to Africa's persistent drought situations. Can that be replicated on the continent?
Yeah, of course, and we are already talking to different governments. We started out in 2003 with research work. The Swiss government supported us, and we made tests in Arab countries. We worked in Australia. We worked for governments only. The technology is very environmentally friendly by ETH and Max Planck and others researched, and it's an ionization process, and we cracked the code what happens the hour before a rainfall started. It was known that electricity and other have an impact, but the computing power of my former companies, I was 94 an internet pioneer here in the forum too, and this, I sold everything, and then I went into this, and we made so much research and cracked the code after a couple of years, and it's a very complex thing, but the influenced areas are between 5,000 and 10,000 square kilometers, thanks to the meteor offices and WMO. We have the data from above, we have our own radars, we have weather stations, and we have the top scientists. The influence and the impact is great, what you just mentioned. Yeah, it's not we never measure our success, it's always the client, the government. And Jordan was now a long test. It was 3 years and a long contract, yeah. And the impact is 27% more rain in the 30-year average, and because the surrounding areas are, thanks to climate change, 8% less, so it's 35%. Agricultural growth, 30%. And yeah, we were honored last year by the Vatican with the prize to be the world's best solution against migration. And they calculated, the jury, American universities, that we could potentially help 1 billion people with water and food security. And then I'm traveling now, which I didn't expect it in the beginning, with cardinals through Africa and make our contacts. And what finally to mention, I think that it's the latest minute, to fight the big droughts. What I've seen here the last months traveling up and down the continent, I must say we have to act with the speed of the problem, not with the speed of some bureaucratic institutions. And then we can have a solution.
But for Africa, though, one of some of the big issues would be cost of the technology and transfer of that technology. What would be some of the challenges for a continent such as Africa that is now facing persistent drought in implementing a technology such as yours?
We are since 15 years without competition. It's very, very complex. So we are a service. And the costs are 1 cubic meter of rain is 1 cent. And then it vapors 80, 90%. And then it stays, and the cubic meter usable water is 10 cents. When you do pumping and piping, then it's around 40, 50 cents. When you do desalination, it's $1 to $3. So we are by far most inexpensive. The volume is very big. The influence to the GDP in Jordan is so big that they can pay us easily out of the additional tax income. So the important, and thank you for the question, is who is bridging the initial financing? And we talked to some countries, I want to not mention the names, but big countries in Africa, and it's only the question how to bridge. And now in Switzerland and London, there are groups forming who will do this as an impact investment and help it, because thank you what you said, it's really a human right. Water should be a human right. And it should be organized, and when there are no other structures, it's of course something interesting for an entrepreneur, an inventor, and at the end, it's all regional, and therefore you can help very fast. When we sign a contract, we are there in the country in 2 months later, and we can operate when the humidity is there the day afterwards. So it's not a question of timing, and it's not. And here was the meeting about infrastructures, Think about desalination. No country in Africa can afford really big desalination, But most of the people live near the coast, and we can pull in the humidity from the coast 100 kilometers to 150 kilometers, depends if there are hills or not there, and then it rains. We recreate and revitalize the structure which was there before climate change. We change climate change, experts say, not me only. Which means you have the situation like 40, 50 years ago.
All right, so we come to the question of financing, because Dr. Fluhrer has mentioned that whole question of financing. And I do want to come back to Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth, because your research from your reinsurance company shows that over 2017 and 2018, the industry paid about $219 billion in claims from weather-related events. But for Cyclone Idai, your company, though, reported that the overall economic loss for Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe was in the order of $2 billion, of which only 7% will be covered by the insurance, leaving a gap of about 93%. That is a huge gap.
Indeed, it is. And we're talking very big numbers. And alluding to what Helmut said, climate change challenge is not something in the future. It's something which is here and now, and it's massive. And if you look at it in relative terms, we're always talking about tropical cyclone in the United States or flooding in Europe, but Idai in Mozambique basically represents 15% of GDP of the country. It's going to throw back the country in its development several years. And so, yes, obviously, these events are devastating. Human tragedies, more than 1,000 dead people. I think a lot of them could have been prevented with better prevention. Then obviously people lose their houses, lose their businesses. Still now, a lot of people are sleeping in tents, no roof above their head. And yes, an impact on a whole region, a whole economy. And then, yes, I think you have alluded to the various dimensions. We are talking about prevention, very important, and your technology plays into that area. We are talking about disaster management when something happens. And then afterwards, we talk about the relief, disaster relief, the emergency aid, and obviously then the financing part, which can come from insurance, from governments, from donations. And if it doesn't come from any of these areas, it's basically people's savings. Most of them don't have savings. It means it's a real economic loss, which they cannot not recover. And it's true that in Africa, the insured part of these losses is significantly lower than globally. Globally, it's low. It's only about 1/3 of values are on average insured. But in Africa, it's below 10%. For me, as a member of the industry, it's frustrating. I look at a 2 billion economic loss, then I see there's less than a 200 million insured loss. I look at our own loss, and I say, I'd be happy to pay more. It's really an insignificant economic loss for Swiss Re. And the reason is because the penetration of insurance is so low. So we have a massive task ahead of us as a system with all our partners, with stakeholders, with government, with regulators, with NGOs, with the insurance associations, with technology firm. All together, we need to increase penetration of insurance as a solution to provide people relief after such an event. Immediate relief, they need the money right after the event. So yes.
So in terms of increasing that low penetration, and you're talking about the insured part of Africa being below 10%, help us to understand what countries like Mozambique, though, can do to bridge that gap and meet your requirements.
Yeah. So I think one very important element is we all come together. So as I said before, government, regulator, insurance companies, but then we need technology firms, we need ecosystems, platforms, because historic insurance products are probably too complex and not affordable for people with low income. So we need to design very simple products, very efficient distribution, and there's very, very simple claims payment. So for example, if you have a small amount and have a loss adjuster going out there making the adjustment, maybe an alternative is to think in terms of parametric solutions, so that you make a payout immediately if a certain weather condition is given. So if you have a hurricane above a certain strength, that triggers the payout, and a few days later, the money is there. So I think there is solutions. There's a lot of good examples from different countries in the world, in China, in Latam, in Kenya. We did some really cool stuff with farmers, but so much more to do. And I think it's a real big task we have as a system all together.
So this is a collective responsibility for all stakeholders, President Faure, because businesses and African governments and the citizens as well all have a role to play in building resilience and combating the effects of climate change. So if you can just tell us how governments and business leaders can work together to identify these climatic risks so as to invest in building resilience.
Yeah. No, but before we go further, I think today we stand in solidarity and, of course, our prayers with the sister island in Bahamas, because they too are feeling the same pain as our countries, the 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. The 3 speakers before me, when I've spoken on insurance, Mlisa on the role of the science and the data, and of course the technology. At the end of the day, I think governments are there to serve the nation, serve citizens. And it is about the type of design that we need to put in place. Certainly, I would say 10 years or 20 years ago, the whole structure of government was not designed to deal with the problem of climate change. We take the example of Mozambique. Mozambique has gone through 20 years of civil war. And at the end of civil war, they put in place a political system to build a nation. No attention was given on the type of roads to be resilient enough to stand up with a cyclone. The type of houses were never built for that. So basically, it has eroded more than 20 years of efforts in Mozambique. And I recently met the president in Mozambique. I had a state visit in Mozambique, and I saw for myself the pain that they now need to, go through, and also the courage that they need to get inside from the people for them to reconstruct the country. So it's really now, from the point of view of policymakers, is rethinking how do we redesign, what type of houses do we need to prepare, the type of roads that we need to have in place, the type of infrastructure. And all this comes with a cost. And I think this is where the international community needs to come into place. I don't think it's a question that we are there, we have the capacity and capability to solve these problems on our own. And it is a collective responsibility of the international financial organizations to come into place. And here I want to challenge the existing financial architecture in the world today, because we do not take the issue, the subject matter of climate change as a factor when we go about in giving support to other countries. And I think this is what is needed today in the new international financial governance. We need to factor the problems that countries in sub-Saharan Africa, island states, in the Pacific, Indian Ocean, and Caribbean. So I think we call for a new global order in the fight against global warming and climate change, so that we put systems in place to better serve the citizens and serve humanity.
Let's talk about those systems that need to be put in place, Andiswa. What is needed, though, from both the public and the private sector in terms of planning, in terms of preparing and responding to natural disasters? Because government, it seems, is doing its part.
Well, I think there's a starting point where we need to build some form of trust in our collaborations amongst the different sectors, whether it's within the scientific community and the private sector and the governments. In most cases, we do have solutions that can actually support government coming from the scientific and the private sector communities. However, the prioritization of the funding by our governments is something that government needs to look at in order to make sure that the solutions that have been put in place or have been developed are actually operationalized and actually mainstreamed within government decision. So let me make an example. So South Africa is a space agency. And there's a policy, national policy that governs this. There's an act that governs this. There's a strategy that governs this. And when you think of that, you think all the instruments, policy and governance-related instruments are put in place. The institution is properly legislated to be in place. So what is missing? The finance to actually deliver on the promise that has been put into the strategy. When we ask for finance for whether satellite-built programs or, in this particular case, just platforms to enable the data that we already have, these decades of information, which through other platforms is now available for free, because we've got advocacy for entities like the Group on Earth Observations that have enabled that globally we have free access to satellite data at high resolution. So it's not just low resolution data, it's high resolution data. When you put this in front of government, government responds with, how am I supposed to put money on a technology to do that when I need to build houses, when I need to give people food, when I need to create employment? This is a question But actually, the question is also the other way around. What is your choice if you do not invest in this? How are you going to know that the houses you're wanting to build, you're not building in a floodplain? How you do not know that that's a 100-year floodplain? You might know that in your lifetime, there has been no flood, but that could be a 50-year floodplain or a 100-year floodplain. And you build those houses, and tomorrow, Cyclone Idai comes, and all of those houses are gone. So it also comes in terms of the drought and food security. You want to spend money on giving people food. So it's good and well, you can give the farmer the seed to plant. But how do you know and support the farmer for the farmer to know that it's time for them to plant because the weather is coming for them to plant? How does the farmer know that they need to fertilize a particular part of their land? Because you have no monitoring system. You've given them the seed. But this partnership and the trust needs to be built between these three sectors to actually, because from a scientific entities as well, is we do not operationalize. We look at private sector to take what we've put in place and they operationalize. But we look at our governments to fund these operational platforms. So governments, I think they need to relook at how they incentivize the science that they've already put out funds to happen, because we funded actually to do the science, but we're not funded to make the science work for government and actually provide solutions to governments.
Right. You want to respond to that?
I fully agree with you. There's a lot of elements which are already there. No data, we have tons of data already. When we talk about hurricanes, we have 50, 60 years. We know the patterns. We can quite well, not exactly, but quite well predict what might happen. Technology as well, marvelous technology, and we can deal with millions of data pieces. And by the way, we are using satellite technology, which probably you have developed for an agricultural insurance program in Kenya, where we use the pictures from space to see if the fields are green, brown, or yellow. And depending on that, you know if it's normal conditions or if it's drought, and if there is going to be a payout. I think the challenge is to bring all these elements together, into one system, create an ecosystem with the right incentives, with the right technology, with the right data, with the financing part, but then as well with transparency and information, creating awareness amongst potential customers to buy insurance. So it seems that all the pieces are around, but we don't manage, all of us here around the table and other stakeholders, to bring it together.
So in terms of trying to bring that together, let me bring you back to the insurance and how African countries are covered by that. How are insurers, though, helping Africa in this regard?
We try to help in the three dimensions, as I mentioned before. One is really prevention, and we have already spoken quite about it. Building codes, for example, or where are you allowed to build, in which areas, in very exposed areas, or not, all these things, education, and so on. Then how to manage an actual disaster. We have a team, public sector solutions team, with a lot of expertise in this area as well, supporting governments. And then obviously, again, the relief part. Capital and capacity in Africa is not a limitation. No. I mentioned before our exposure, despite the fact that we are a market leader in Mozambique, is very limited. We could write so much more. So from this perspective, supply is not the issue. But supply and demand do not meet, because actually what we offer is maybe not what the consumers need or can afford. So we need to, the supply and the demand curve, we need to make them match at one point of time. Affordability, I think, yes, what we offer now is for most people not affordable. We can influence affordability, obviously one is by increase of income of the consumers, but by making products more efficient, by more efficient distribution, but as well by subsidies from governments, at least as a kickstart in the beginning, as well, donations in the beginning. The tools are there. we need to, I think all together we need to do a better job of making it work and helping to make here the world less vulnerable, more resilient to these events.
I think we need to catch up, Marshall.
Yeah.
I think
Go ahead,
we need to catch up.
Yeah.
You know, science is there for us. Government, we need to understand. Policymakers, we need to understand the science. The technology is there. How do you make available this technology to other countries? How international partners come into play?
Yeah.
You know, we are running out of time.
Yeah.
We
We have to
running-
act with the speed of the problem,
Exactly.
not with the speed of bureaucrats. And here are the 4 players, let's say, yeah, but there are many more. The most important thing I noticed in the last month is that the silos are still too strong. And you mentioned it, yeah? You have to have better access to we talk about severe weather events, yeah? We will never, nobody, yeah, can stop them. They will happen. But they are a small part, maybe only 5% of the whole damages. 95% is the drought in Africa. Yeah? We have to talk for 1 minute about that, because there are more people killed, more children suffer. It's not only the wrong water quality, it's no water. Yeah? And when you look at the whole chain, and therefore many more are interested to solve it, you have water, and if you don't have water, you don't have food, you don't have jobs, you are forced in migration, you are forced in immigration, Europe was Arabian countries, and then the whole system, yeah, becomes unstable. So I look at our company now as an international security company, yeah? Okay. And this we discussed also in Munich on the Munich Security Forum, because 10 years ago I spoke with a head of water in a ministry of agriculture, and they were sitting, excuse me, at the end of the table in the cabinet. Today, it's always with the president, and that's right. And they should join. And I think the 20 new heads of states in Africa this year, they have a huge opportunity and challenge that they started. They have to do something. And it's not the money. You are fully right. There's so much money everywhere, yeah? But it has to be organized and a little bit shake. The European governments are existing. They want to do something. They have to do something, but they are slow. The African countries, governments are new. They are not coordinating among their neighbors and so on, but it's getting better. And if this comes together, and according to where we are sitting, yeah, the forum is committed for improving the state of the world. Yeah, there has to be something, a kick. Yeah, and it's not necessary. Many people. Yeah, what I heard yesterday from Professor Schwab was that there will be joint contracts between the United Nations and the forum to help to bring private-public partnership together with the government easier. Of course, we are dedicated to do jobs within the SDG world, because the SDGs are all related to so many businesses and industries, yeah? And we have to take care in our own interest not to kill everything, yeah? Because like the financial people, they must take care of their investments. If somebody invested in North Africa, right, and now the Sahara moves into the Mediterranean, yeah, their land has no value anymore. They are also interested. And this is, I believe, Mr. President, that if there is now a little movement, which is a nucleus, and which maybe starts here or somewhere, but now, yeah, then we will see a big change, because there is a big interest. And I only can add, I was invited by the 8 biggest faiths. They have an organization where their project managers and finance experts sit together. They are 80 people, they present 5.6 billion people, and they have 3.3 trillion US under management. They are also interested to coordinate. And there is much more behind the curtain already existing, yeah, where they, for instance, but there has to be somebody to invite them, yeah, maybe to the Seychelles. Everybody loves to go there, yeah, to sit together. Yeah,
they can come, eh?
Yeah, they come, yeah.
They can come anytime.
You have enough hills that you will be not drowned, yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I'd like to take some questions from the floor, because I'm sure you have some questions for members of our panel. If yes, at the front here. If we can have a microphone at the front, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to come from the finance aspect. I'm from the insurance sector. They don't feel that I'm attacking the insurance industry. How are we going to finance this whole challenge of climate change when people are still living on $1 a day, right? What part of that dollar are they going to give to us insurance companies to insure them against such disasters? Now, the other question that I have, and this is in particular for you, Mr. President, is we all know that there is financing available, there's solutions available, there's the science, there's the data, there's the insurance, there's all of that. But as of today, although most of Western countries are the ones with the highest carbon emission, the financial flow in Africa is probably 2% of the global flow. So what are you, governments, are doing to get more of that money into our continent so we can finance all the things that are available?
Thank you. We'll take another comment before. Yes, at the back here. In the meantime, you can go ahead, Bert.
Yes. So I think it's a good point, no, that affordability is a challenge. Now, insurance has a penetration or a share of the GDP in Africa, in most countries, below 1%. There's a couple of countries where it has 3 to 4. South Africa is the only exception where it's above 10%. So I agree with you, it's a very long way to get to everybody and to have 100% inclusion. But now we are still setting, what we are providing is solutions basically to industrial risk, to corporate risk, to commercial risks, and to high-income people. Now there's still millions and millions of people who are somewhere in the middle income segment or in the lower income segment. The last few years there has been a significant growth of people in Africa included in the financial system. And in the meanwhile, there is platforms available. We all have them on our iPhones where transactional costs or frictional costs are minimum. So in the meanwhile, we can offer insurance products with a premium of $1 or $2 per month in an efficient way. So I agree with you to cover everybody now. It's a long journey, but there's so much more we can do to reduce the protection gap massively in the next few years.
President Faure.
No, what we've been doing, we've been insisting that the Green Climate Fund is replenished. And I think this is very important because this has been international pledge by industrial countries. And this is a subject matter that will be discussed in the margins of the United Nations General Assembly around the 23rd of September. So our role as small states and our role as members of the African Union is to insist that the Green Climate Fund is replenished, and all the countries that made their pledge, they commit themselves and they put the money there.
Right. We'll take
Exactly.
the comment from the back.
Let me stand up. Hi, I am Barka I'm a global shaper from the Portless Hub in Mauritius, another small island developing state. And one of the questions that I was asking myself was about finance, but that has already been addressed. The other thing that I was wondering is, there is an increasing move to include climate change as a security issue. There are some countries who have insisted that this be part of the UN Security Council even. Is this something that should be framed as a defense and security issue in Africa for it to gain more traction, more funding, and more attention and political will?
Right, I'll throw that to the floor.
No, I think Seychelles, yes. I think Seychelles, we have been talking about the issue of how do we treat the issue of climate change as a security issue. And recently I was attending the SADC meeting, and I think this is something that we are discussing. We will also push in the next heads of government meeting in February next year, and it has to be featured high on the peace and security agenda of the African Union.
Thank you. Another question at the back?
If you allow me, I'm going to speak in French. So, ce que je voudrais dire, c'est une autre dimension.
Monsieur, What I'd like to mention maybe is something else that we would need to take into account, a question of climate change and the impact that it can have on jobs. Maybe I should say that I belong to ILO, the International Labour Organization, and according to our studies, when or if there is an increase in temperature of a few percent, but if we keep our forecasts as they are nowadays, we will have a loss of job. About 80 million of jobs will be lost. And this represents a huge loss, and as I repeat, 80 million employments will disappear for the African continent, especially Western Africa.
No, it's a comment, madam, if I may.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm taking questions, sir.
Okay.
No, it's a comment.
About also the social dimension and also about the jobs related to the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yes, go ahead.
Always when mankind faced the problem, they found a solution, yeah? And new jobs were created. And I think we are a small part to contribute, yeah? There will be a lot of additional effects, yeah? We create now in Jordan what Royal Court testifies around, in a small country, 15,000 jobs a year, and it goes further. We calculated for Kenya in 10 years, 800,000 new jobs, yeah, because farming will develop and the follow-up. So I'm not negative about that. Where I'm negative, and this is what you mentioned before, is to prevent and to have this meeting soon, the wars on water. The boundary waters and so on are the biggest threat I see in Africa, where you share, you know, the Nile problematic and so on. I mustn't mention it, everybody knows in the room, yeah. And this is something where I see the biggest problem. And if you can solve this, yeah, like they solve it now in Jordan with Israel and the others again, yeah, to rebuild Syria, how they solve it between Mexico and California, this is the most important thing. Because if there is a model how to solve it, yeah, and you prepare it with your data, and that's so important, I can tell you, before, when I started these inventions, and I got all these data, I must say I'm absolutely fascinated how these persons are preparing the best data to handle and to understand our daily life much better. Yeah?
Right.
And therefore, with this data, and then the transborder water prevention, this is so important.
So we're going to wind up in a minute. I'm told I have 5 minutes left, and I want to get a commitment from all of you on the floor. I know, Mlisa, you have something to say here, but let me start with you, President Faure, your takeaways from this situation and your personal commitment at the World Economic Forum for Africa. So over the next 3 years, though, what would be the one solution you will implement or you think should be implemented to deal with the effects of climate change in your country or in Africa? Very briefly, we have a very short time.
No, I think as a state and as a leader, as a president of the country, we have taken a series of decisions. We need to implement the decisions. We cannot have summit after summit. I think we need to implement the decisions. And we can only implement the decisions that we have taken whereby partners that have pledged to put the money, they also do their bit. So it's a partnership. As Mlisa said, there has to be trust. It takes two to tango. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Fluhrer.
That's a clear call to action. If we don't act now, yeah, we are losers. And we lose more, not only for our next generation, it's already us. Yeah? We are not so old that we will not see it. Yeah? And I hope that we can roll out, yeah? Financing is ready, the people are ready, we are happy to help, yeah? But there has to be a PPP, yeah? Private partnership, yeah? And well, and when the session is finished, we can talk.
Andiswa.
From the Earth Observations community, our pledge is very clear. We have a data platform that goes back 50 years of satellite imagery covering the whole of the continent, Digital Earth Africa. And the invitation is tap into this platform and actually see what you can see of your country. The questions around security, whether climate change to be a security issue, all you need to do is to view the change of water issues and transboundary issues. Here's a platform where if you're sitting in Zimbabwe, you can see what your fellow countrymen or neighbors are doing with the same water source that you're dependent on because you're downstream up north. The issue and the impact in Mozambique from Idai was not about the amount of rainfall that fell within Mozambique. It's the amount of water that came from the neighboring countries. We need to actually start looking at this issue as going across boundaries. It's not about what each country is doing, it's about what do you understand about what's happening even in your neighboring countries to enable you to put proper response mechanism in your own country. And we have a platform to actually enable all countries, and we invite private sector to come into this platform and develop solutions for the local communities, solutions that talk to the communities. We cannot say data is an issue anymore. We're no longer there. We cannot say the processing platforms because it's big data is an issue anymore. We're making the commitment. Thank you to the Australian government and the Helmut Foundation for actually allowing us, for Africa to be the first continent to build a data cube that's continent-wide. All we can now need to do is to show, can it actually help our governments and us as society to make better decisions?
Right, Bert?
So I guess from Swiss Re, you get more than a commitment. This is actually the purpose. This is the reason why we exist as Swiss Re, to make the world more resilient and to help narrowing that protection gap. And it's actually one of the main reasons why when I was looking for a new job end of last year, I decided to move with my family 11,000 kilometers further south to Cape Town to work with my teams and together make a contribution to the continent, dedicate my energy, my life, my passion to, although it's going to be a small one, but to make an impact and make sure that we have next Idai in Mozambique in a few years. The relevance of our system, the tragedy is going to be minor than it is now.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our session, Combating Africa's Climate Challenges. Thank you very much for your interest and your patience, and may I thank my distinguished panelists, His Excellency Danny Faure, President of the Seychelles, Director Andiswa Mlisa, Dr. Helmut Fluhrer, and Beatrice Strebel. Thank you very much for your contribution. This is now a wrap. Good evening.